Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome to this week's installment of the Crow Canyon webinar series. This particular installment is brought to you in part by the Hexagon chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society. That's why I'm here. I'm Carrie Schler, and I'm the vice president of the Hexagon chapter. So I thought I'd introduce this particular lecture. So we're going to hear today about Robert Bischoff's work on San Juan Red Ware. Before we get started with the talk, I want to give everybody a little bit of background. Okay. The first thing is to, of course, thank all the people that make this possible. Crow Canyon has received funding from the Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, Economic Stabilization Plan of 2020. So we really appreciate that funding to help us make these webinars happen. But we also want to thank all of the donors, small donors. I know people have been giving $5, $20 when they've come to these lectures, and we really appreciate all of those donations to help us get to you even in the pandemic period when we can't get to you in person. I also want to thank Dylan Schwint and Taylor Hasbrock, who are doing all the behind the scenes work to make these webinars happen. So thank you, Dylan and Taylor. If you're new to Zoom, which seems like that's probably getting to be a smaller and smaller group, everyone's been spending a lot of time on Zoom lately. Let's give you a little bit of background. You can move the box that has my head in it now, and we'll have Robert's head in it later when he's speaking. You can move that around if it's covering any part of the slides that you want to see. So please feel free to do that if you want to see a full screen. You can also move them off to the corner and be able to see almost the whole screen. We'll be moderating the question and answer box that is on the bottom of your screen. You should see a place where you can type in questions. And we'll be moderating those and asking those questions at the end of the webinar. I think Taylor said we have over 250 people that have registered for the webinar, so we might not get to every question if everyone asks the question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. If you're having difficulties with Zoom, you can also go over to our Facebook page and watch it live on Facebook Live. And if you want to see things again or you have to leave early, you can always watch it on Crow Canyon's YouTube page. You can also subscribe to the YouTube page so that you can get all of these webinars and see them all again. Crow Canyon's mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. I'd encourage you to go to Crow Canyon's website and look at all of the great resources there. There's a lot of things for working with school kids and teaching them about archaeology, as well as access for college students that might be looking for data to use in research projects. So there's all kinds of things that you can have access to on Crow Canyon's website. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, and Dene people on whose traditional homelands we work and reside. We're very grateful to all Indigenous people who continue to preserve and protect cultural traditions, maintain ancestral relationships, and steward the lands here in the Four Corners region. We have two upcoming webinars that I want to mention. Next week, we have a webinar with Dr. Steve Nash, where he'll be talking about a large tree ring data set and the reconstruction of pre-Columbian history in the Southwest. And then the following week, we have a talk by Dr. Lawrence Lohendorf on the Pueblo Archaeological and Historical Society presents the Archaeology of Rock Art. So we hope that you'll come back and listen to those two webinars as well as this one. A number of folks have been asking everyone at Crow Canyon if there are community organizations that they can do to support Indigenous people in the Southwest during this really difficult time of coronavirus. And these are a number of the places that we recommend that you support if you want to help. The Pueblo Relief Fund, the official Navajo Nation COVID Relief Fund, the Hopi Relief Fund, Navajo and Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund, and the Bluff Area Mutual Aid Fund. All of these would be great places to help out if you're able. So finally, I get to introduce Robert. Robert today is going to be talking about his master's thesis work on San Juan Red Ware and social networks across the Southwest. He did his master's work at BYU University. He is now working on a PhD at Arizona State University. His dissertation now is focused on exploring the relationships between material culture, networks and using networks of interaction, using pottery, projectile points, architecture, and other types of material culture to really look at those connections. So please join me in welcoming Robert to talk about his research. I will now stop sharing, and Robert will share his screen, and we can get going.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm particularly honored to have been invited to present today. I'm grateful to you, Carrie, and to Taylor at Crow Canyon for your assistance in getting prepared, and to the Hexagon chapter and Crow Canyon. I did get to see one chapter lecture. I believe it was Jim Potter a few years ago present in Cortez, and that was a great experience. Didn't think that I'd be presenting at one of the meetings, and certainly not while sitting at home in Phoenix, but I am grateful for this opportunity. So I'm going to talk to you about San Juan Red Ware, a particular type of pottery that was made in southeast Utah between around 750 and 1050 AD, so produced for about 300 years. Now, I'd like to say I got interested in this topic because it's one of the more interesting types of pottery in the Southwest, but the truth is, my professor at Brigham Young University is the one who suggested the topic for my master's thesis, but I have never regretted it. I think it really is one of the more interesting types of pottery in the Southwest. Now, this presentation actually builds off of my master's thesis. In my thesis, I combined a whole lot of data, and I made a bunch of maps and charts. And so today, I'm going to show you a bunch of maps and charts, but using some updated data. I do assume you have a basic familiarity with the archaeology of the Southwest, but feel free to ask questions if I mention something you're not familiar with, and then Carrie can let me know if you have one. Most of the data I present comes from the CyberSouthwest project. If you haven't heard of this, you can go to cybersw.org, and you can look at all of this data for yourself. It's live right now. It's on the website. You do have to register for an account, but you do not have to be an archaeologist. It's a great tool for educators, for volunteers who are interested in, well, helping and contributing with the project, but also just looking at the data and learning more about the Southwest. The last I checked, the database had more than 13.7 million ceramics, 350,000 flake stone artifacts, including 10,000 sourced obsidian artifacts, and 2,000 public architectural features. All of this data comes from more than 25,000 settlements. And the locations are masked somewhat on the website, but you can get different levels of access depending on your research position and needs. So on the left is not all of the data from the CyberSouthwest project, but it is what is included in this project today. There's actually a lot more data in Utah, in southern Arizona, and then in California across the Colorado River as well. And then down into Mexico, there's a lot more data being added all of the time. So it's a great resource to use, and I'm happy to be able to take advantage of it. So on the right are all the sites in the database that contain San Juan Red Ware between 750 and 1050. There are a few sites with San Juan Red Ware that aren't shown, particularly in southern Nevada, but these date outside of this period, possibly due to less accurate dating, as is a common problem in the Virgin area, which is located here. So we're just going to leave those out today. On the right is the zoomed in study area that includes all of the sites with San Juan Red Ware. Many of my maps will show you this view, but I want to make sure you are oriented, as I've kept landmarks off the maps to make it simpler. If it helps, the red dot right here is in Phoenix, and you can clearly see the Four Corners area at the top right. So this is everything within this area here. Okay. And then in my initial study, I focused just on the Four Corners region, and this will be the other unit of analysis, which is shown in this square right here. For analyses, just including the Four Corners region, I excluded all of the other sites in the database. So only the yellow dots within this red square will be included in analyses that just show this zoomed in Four Corners view. The rest of the analyses will be including all of this data. The way I define these boundaries actually is I just took all of the sites that had more than 25% San Juan Red Ware and then increased the boundary a little bit, and it gave me a pretty similar view to what I had for my master's thesis, which I thought was fairly interesting. One important note, though, is that 25% is only of the decorated pottery. None of the analyses will include any of the planeware counts, so it's just the types of pottery that had decorations on them. And this is the same way it was done in the Southwest Social Networks project and the Chaco Social Networks project. These decorated wares were usually the ones that were traded more widely, and it's easier to tell them apart from some of the plain wares that can often get confused in between areas when they are traded. So before I get into any details of my analysis, I want to give you a little more background on San Juan Red Ware and what makes it so interesting. There are three recognized types within San Juan Red Ware. The earliest is Abajo red on orange. Bluff black on red was produced a few decades later, beginning at 780, and marks the transition to black paint instead of red. Deadman's black on red was produced starting at 880, and it lasts until the end of the production of San Juan Red Ware, again, somewhere around 1050. The origin of San Juan Red Ware has been the topic of some study. Now, southeastern Utah was sparsely occupied between about 700 and 750, and it's during the reoccupation of the area after 750 that San Juan Red Ware was first introduced. And also you start to see aggregated villages like Alkali Ridge, where all of the houses are built right up next to each other in the Pueblo style. Many researchers have argued for a non-local origin for this pottery, although there's not universal agreement on that. Jim Allison notes that the technology and design styles are much more similar to ceramics in the southern Southwest than to the local pottery made at that time in the Mesa Verde region. The designs gradually become more similar to Mesa Verde, and Deadman's black on red shares some design styles with Mesa Verde whiteware, even though you can tell them apart. It even includes some Degozi-style cross-hatching, which is associated with Chaco Canyon. Now, briefly, for those not familiar with Chaco Canyon, it's an area in northwest New Mexico where there were massive pueblos built, and it became this sort of dominant cultural influence for a huge area all around Chaco Canyon, including it into southeastern Utah and farther down into central New Mexico and Arizona. San Juan Red Ware was produced only in southeastern Utah, but perhaps just a little bit across the border in Colorado. But in much of the area where it is found, it is not a local pottery. So most of the places it's found, it was traded in from southeast Utah. And we know it was made there from sourcing of the clays and from evidence for production for the ware. But the end of San Juan Red Ware is also interesting. Segi orange ware was produced starting around 1000 in northeastern Arizona across the San Juan River from its origin, and is remarkably similar to San Juan Red Ware in many ways. One early archaeologist even argued that the two wares should be combined. They are certainly distinctive and you can tell them apart, but I don't think anyone would argue that they are not closely related. It seems what likely happened is that the producers of San Juan Red Ware moved across the San Juan River and into the Kayenta area of northeastern Arizona and began producing a similar type of pottery, although with new types of temper and clay, as they no longer had access to the same temper sources that they used to use. This is a histogram showing the distances that San Juan Red Ware was circulated compared to other ceramics. All the data I use has been divided into 50-year intervals. Let me explain how this chart was created. To calculate the distances that you see here on the x-axis, Matt Peoples and I calculated the centroid for all the sites that have a particular ware. For example, with San Juan Red Ware, we took every site that had it, and we calculated a central point between these sites, but we weighted the centroid so it'll be closer to sites that have a lot of it. We then calculated the distance from every site with San Juan Red Ware to that centroid. Now, we repeated this for all of the wares in the database, which might sound like a lot of work, but thanks to the R programming language, it's just a loop that runs through all of the wares and gives us all of the distances, which produces a lot of data. But what we have here is a summary of that data. We took the median distance for each ceramic ware and then plotted the data in this histogram. So for example, you can see in the 750 period in the top right that San Juan Red Ware was the most widely traded ware or circulated ware on average, higher than the other wares in this time period. The 800s, including the 800 and 850 periods, it's not the most widely circulated, possibly because there were a lot of sites that contain these wares that were located in southwest Colorado. A lot of those were part of the Dolores Archaeological project, where there was an abundance of San Juan Red Ware in many sites. But then for the rest of the time periods from 900 on, you can see that San Juan Red Ware is an outlier that grows wider as time goes on. It was traded on average a huge distance. So basically, the average site that had San Juan Red Ware was located 150 kilometers from where it originated in the period between 1000 and 1050. One of the interesting things about red wares is that they were quite often associated with feasting. We have good evidence that San Juan Red Ware is particularly associated with feasting in Colorado and other areas. And red wares in general seem to have this trait that they share. In later time periods, red ware bowls became much larger. They were painted in really bold designs on the outside that would have been really easily seen by others, even in a large group. So it seems that San Juan Red Ware was one of the earlier types of red wares that was associated with this tradition. And usually you find red ware, San Juan Red Ware, as a bowl instead of a jar or some other vessel design. So before I go into any more analysis using the data from the CyberSouthwest project, I'm going to show you results I got for the database I originally put together for my master's thesis. When I did that, I took the massive amount of data that the Village Ecodynamics project compiled, of which Crow Canyon was a major part, and combined it with the Chaco Social Network Space database and a bunch of other data from various site reports and other sources. Now, this data differs in a couple of major ways from what is in the CyberSouthwest project, although there is definitely a lot of overlap. The CyberSouthwest project is primarily composed of large sites, but my data has a number of very small sites, which is a big difference. So I ended up with about 3 times more sites in the same area, the Four Corners area, than what I have in the CyberSouthwest project. I also didn't include any sites after 81,000, so the CyberSouthwest data does give me an extra 50 years or so of data, which is really helpful to see some of the trends. But then one final note about the database I used for my master's thesis is that a lot of the Village Ecodynamics project data did not include non-local ceramics. It didn't have the specific types of wares in them. And that has some interesting effects on the networks, which I will demonstrate for you in a moment. So here we're just looking at the Four Corners area. You can see the state lines in the center. And this is a hexagon distribution map. One of the things I like about this type of distribution map, better than some others, is that it shows really well where we don't have data. That doesn't mean that nobody was living there. It just means we have no data from that area, although there are many parts of this map that were certainly uninhabited during these time periods. So what these hexagons show you is that all of the sites contained within the hexagon calculated how much San Juan Red Ware was there and then divided it from the total number of ceramics. So we get a more smoothed idea of how much San Juan Red Ware there is. You can see that it was widely distributed in southwest Colorado even in the earliest period, but that we have an easterly and then a trend further south. 850 to 900 is when great houses were first built in Chaco Canyon, which is right around this area. So you can see that San Juan Red Ware was present in the area from the very beginning of the Chaco phenomenon, although it was present in very low amounts. It wasn't a major thing, and it was also mainly in smaller sites, as you'll see that these sites are missing from the CyberSouthwest database when we get to them later. You can also see that in southwest Colorado, particularly in this top area around the Dolores area, there are often a very high percentage of San Juan Red Ware, though it does decrease over time, which is notable. And it will see that it starts to trend more to the southwest in the CyberSouthwest database.
Robert, can I interrupt for 1 second? We can't see your cursor, which is fine. It just means you probably need to do a little bit more describing of what area you're talking about. I kind of think.
Can you see it now?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that interruption. Again, feel free to interrupt if anything else. So Chaco Canyon down here, Dolores area up here, Four Corners area. Being able to see my cursor certainly might help. Thank you. All right, so this is a map showing the social networks that were constructed for my thesis database. And what these networks are really, they're ceramic similarity networks. So I use similar methods as to what were used for the Southwest and the Chaco Social Networks projects, if you're familiar with those. But what I did was I created a matrix of sites that show how similar the ceramics were to each other, the assemblages. It's scaled to 1. So sites that are a 1 are identical in ceramic assemblages, both in the types of ceramics and the proportions, and sites that are 0 have no ceramics in common. And when I calculate the statistics for the networks, I use all of the data, all of the types of similarity scores. But when I show you the maps, I cut it off at 75% similarity, which is what was done in similar projects in the past. It makes the networks a bit easier to read. You can see in the earlier period, no connections between the Chaco Canyon area and the Mesa Verde area, but this area is really closely connected and expands through time. And you see some connections between the Mesa Verde area and the south, but they are not particularly strong. So network models can be fun, and you can certainly gain some information from visualization. A lot of people like to look at the structure of networks that way, but social network analysis is a lot more than just making charts that have tons of lines and nobody really can tell what exactly is going on. A key element in a lot of social network analyses is something called centrality. Basically, we want to know what sites are most important to the structure of the network. There are a lot of different ways to calculate centrality, though. The way that I think is most commonly used to do it in these types of networks in archaeology, and the one I like the most, is a metric that doesn't just count how many connections each site has, but also measures how many connections the sites they are connected to have. So a way to think about this is if you have only one friend, so your network is connected from you to one person, but that person you're connected to, that friend has 100 other friends. So with this type of centrality, that gives you a much higher score than, for example, say somebody who has maybe 5 friends, but those friends don't have any other friends. It's just a smaller network. So you imagine that the person who has the bigger extended social network has more advantages in a lot of social situations. This is the same concept with these sites. How many sites are these sites connected to, and how many sites are connected to those sites? And this created some really interesting patterns. They are so specific, I had to double check to make sure they're real, but they do seem to be. You can see that San Juan Red Ware for 750, 900, and 950, these maps here, The more San Juan Red Ware you have, which is this axis, the lower your centrality score. That means you're less well connected to the network if you have lots of San Juan Red Ware, which is not what I expected to see. However, in the 800s, in these two periods, see a much different relationship. Now, in this case, if you have just a bit more than 50% San Juan Red Ware, in that case, you're the most highly central site in the network. And it goes down a little bit if you have more, but it's still highly central, especially compared to the other periods, which is a lot different than what we're having happen. And one of the interesting things about the hundreds is that this is really the big period of growth, especially in southwestern Colorado. You have this transition from dispersed hamlet-style houses to these larger villages in many cases. And it seems that people are really coming together a lot more and perhaps forming new identities. Now, as a comparison to this, I'm going to show you the centrality scores for Mesa Verde whiteware, which is the other type of decorated ceramic that was made in the Mesa Verde region. In this case, you can see an exact opposite trend from San Juan Red Ware in these three periods, where the more Mesa Verde whiteware you have, the more centrally located you are in the network. But in the 800s and 850s, we see almost the exact same pattern as San Juan Red Ware. So it really does seem like the red ware people and the white ware people were really getting along well in this period. And then something happened to ruin that relationship. And it's suspiciously close to when Chaco Canyon starts to get big. I'm, of course, simplifying things a lot. There were no people who were just the red ware and the white ware people, although it does seem that ceramics, in many cases, were associated with a social group, and San Juan Red Ware likely was. But something very different is happening in this century. It's a common way to look at the distributions of tradeware artifacts is to look at their fall-off curves. I decided not to include any sort of smoothing line in this data, as there really isn't much of a fall-off. One thing to note is the scale, which goes up to 400 kilometers. In case you're curious, this dot here, that's 400 kilometers away, that's the distance from the centroid we calculated for San Juan Red Ware near the Four Corners to Las Colinas, which is a Hohokam site in the Phoenix Basin. So this is about the distance from the Four Corners area to where I am now. It went a very long ways, especially in the later periods. But even in the earlier periods, you can still see that sites close to 200 kilometers away still had a lot of San Juan Red Ware, and that increases over time. It was really widely distributed. Mesa Verde whiteware, on the other hand, was not nearly as widely distributed. Note the scale only goes to a little past 200 kilometers. Also, there are no real linear trends in this as well. It's quite similar to the San Juan Red Ware in many cases as well. And you can see some outliers that had a lot of Mesa Verde whiteware, even at some distances for that as well. Then I want to use one additional comparison. This is probably one of the most common types of pottery found in the Southwest, certainly in the CyberSouthwest database. And this is Cibola whiteware, which was produced, the center of it would be around the Zuni Pueblo today. Now, in this case, there is a lot more of a fall-off curve, and if I had logged the axis, you'd see a much more linear relationship. There are some major outliers, but this is kind of what I expected to see for San Juan Red Ware, but surprisingly, it really didn't have that fall-off. I want to go back and look at the distribution of San Juan Red Ware just using the data from the CyberSouthwest. So we've got more hexagons for you. And in this case, we see the data that was missing in my database in northeastern Arizona is present here. And you can see that in the Kayenta area, there's a lot of San Juan Red Ware pottery. You can also see in earlier periods that we don't have anything for the Chaco area until the 950 period. It must be because San Juan Red Ware was present only in the smaller sites, which is an interesting case. Not sure what caused that, but something that would be worth looking into a little bit further. So the trend from south and to the west, rather than the south and east trend, makes a lot of sense because this is where Segi orange ware ended up being produced. So the people who are producing San Juan Red Ware here likely came down to this area and started making a similar type of pottery. And you can see that there were a lot of connections to that area early in time. Zoomed out view shows a similar trend, although you can see the southwest trend perhaps a little bit easier. And then again, this dot in the bottom left is where Phoenix is located. This is the Las Colinas site. Not very much San Juan Red Ware got there, but I did see examples of San Juan Red Ware in the Casa Grande Museum, which is a little south of Phoenix, a HOCOM site, and I know there was some found at the Pueblo Grande site as well. So now let's look at the social networks from the CyberSouthwest data. You can see in the Four Corners region the formation of three distinct clusters: the Mesa Verde cluster, the Chusca cluster, and we'll say here is the Chaco Canyon cluster, but really this is part of the greater Cibola network, which you'll see more of in the next slide. While these clusters are certainly distinct, you can also see that there are a lot of connections in between them. So while these networks are mostly isolated, certainly there was a lot of interaction in between all of these areas, and a lot of the pottery have a lot of similarities in design styles, even if they were made out of different types of clay and with different technologies. So here we see most of the Southwest social networks. See, earlier in time, you have very distinct network for the HOCOM, the Mimbres area, Cibola. In the Mesa Verde area forms more over time. There weren't as many large sites in the database earlier. And then you see the real development of the Kayenta and Tusayan and Chusca areas. But notice how massive the Cibola network is. And that will play a big part in the centrality analysis I'll discuss in a moment. Note, however, that the number of connections in between clusters increases period by period, and that there are a lot of connections between all of the areas of the Southwest as far as pottery goes. So when we look at San Juan Red Ware centrality, just for the data in the Four Corners area, we see that the centrality is very low. In the early period, it's almost always zero, a few outliers in the other periods. But mainly, San Juan Red Ware is found in sites that aren't very central to the network at all. This changes, and this is despite, again, only showing data for the Four Corners area. But the 800s is very different, just as it was before. It's still not highly central, but it is much more central than other periods. And it's a trend that's mirrored in the broader network. So this is San Juan Red Ware centrality scores when I use the entire Southwest social networks. Basically the same pattern, just slightly smaller centrality values. Mesa Verde whiteware has almost identical data in the 800s, but overall it actually has a lot higher centrality in the Four Corners than San Juan Red Ware. And again, it shows the same pattern for the broader Mesa Verde network. Cibola whiteware, especially in the last three periods, but also a bit in the earliest period, seems to be the biggest driver in the centrality. Basically, the more Cibola whiteware you have at a site, the more central it is in the network. This is despite the fact that most of the Cibola network is excluded from this particular analysis. But we do see a definite negative relationship in the 800s, which I haven't investigated fully what is driving centrality in those periods. But it certainly seems to be something very different than what's happening in other time periods. In the network as a whole, you can see that Cibola whiteware equals network centrality. The more Cibola whiteware you have, the higher the centrality scores are for the network. Now, this does make some sense geographically. If you recall, the map Cibola region is kind of in the center of the Mimbres. You would go probably through that area from the Hohokam going to the Mesa Verde area. So it does make sense that it would be one of the most central wares. But there is another explanation. And that is that the Cibola data was actually foundational to the projects that turned into the CyberSouthwest database. It also has a lot of excavation data, a lot of great quality data. So it's possible that this relationship has more to do with the nature of the database than the actual historical patterns. Now that's a problem, but I think it's something that we can solve with more hexagons. So what I did was I created a hexagon grid across the Southwest, similar to what I did for the San Juan Red Ware distribution maps, but these hexagons are much larger. They're 72 kilometers across. And if you're wondering why 72 kilometers, I based that off of an estimate that Mark Varian made from some ethnographic data that you could go somewhere and come back in a day would be 18 kilometers. So I doubled that, and that was 36 kilometers, which didn't aggregate the data quite well enough. So I doubled it again to create these hexagons. And what I then did was I took all of the sites that were in each hexagon and combined all of the ceramic data, and then combined that into a single point at the center of each hexagon. So for these networks, we can see that they're much less sparse or much sparser. We have only 5 sites for the Mimbres region, a few more for the Hohokam and the Cibola. But we see a lot more of the connections that go between regions through this type of network. It doesn't seem nearly as clustered, although the Cibola network still we see a lot of closely connected sites that all have very similar assemblages. The centrality is where it gets really interesting. In the original network, San Juan Red Ware is not highly central or correlated with centrality. However, you can start to see an increasing trend towards centrality, particularly later in time. And this network is calculated with all of the data from the database, not just the Four Corners region. You can see a lot higher centrality values for San Juan Red Ware. A very different pattern than we saw before. Mesa Verde whiteware, you don't see quite the linear correlation. It's a bit all over the place, maybe decreasing in the last few periods and increasing in the first few periods. But it too has much higher centrality. The big difference, well, perhaps not the biggest difference, but Cibola whiteware shows a major difference in that it's not the primary driver of the network anymore. It is definitely a strong positive correlation. The more Cibola whiteware you have, the more central you are, but it no longer dominates. And this seems to suggest that Cibola whiteware really is a central ware in the ceramic similarity networks of the Southwest. And it's not just because there are a ton of sites that have Cibola whiteware. So to kind of finish up here, I have one last graphic to describe the importance of San Juan Red Ware. Now this was a lot easier to calculate, but I do need to explain what's going on here. So what this shows is for each period and for the most common types of ceramics in the database, it shows how commonly a ware is the most popular ware in the sites that have it. So for example, in the 1000 period, 16% of all the sites that have San Juan Red Ware have San Juan Red Ware as the most common type. So it means that most of the sites that have San Juan Red Ware, some other type of ware is more common. You can see Mimbres whiteware, which is well known for having a very tight distribution. Usually when you find Mimbres whiteware, that's mostly what you find. It's almost always the dominant ceramic type. But even Middle Gila buffware, which is a Hohokam ceramic, and Cibola whiteware and Tusayan whiteware, have similar patterns, although not quite as strong. There's a lot more variation with Mesa Verde whiteware and Chusca whiteware, but clearly San Juan Red Ware is an outlier in that it's often not the dominant ceramic. In the earlier periods, slightly more than half the sites had San Juan Red Ware as the most common type of decorated pottery, but it's much lower than the others. This outlier down here is probably because San Juan Red Ware wasn't being produced as much in the 1000s, and Segi Orange Ware had already started to be produced and was gradually overtaking it as San Juan Red Ware production faded away. But it's interesting to know that San Juan Red Ware, despite this, was still traded more widely than all of the well-known trade wares, including Cibola whiteware, but even later wares like Roosevelt Red Ware, commonly known as Salado, White Mountain Red Ware, the Jetto yellow and orange wares that were made on the Hopi Mesas. San Juan Red Ware was earlier than these types, but was still had a wider average distance of circulation than all of those types. So from all of this, I have just a few main takeaways for you. First, looking at just the Four Corners area, it seems that San Juan Red Ware reaches its maximum prominence in networks in the Mesa Verde area in the 800s. But then it declines over time after the 900s and becomes much more common in the Kayenta area and other parts of Arizona, in addition to where it's made in southeastern Utah. Another point is that San Juan Red Ware does seem to be an important part of long-distance ceramic similarity networks. Once we adjusted to take out some of the numerous sites in the Cibola and other areas, you can see that San Juan Red Ware does seem to be an important part of those networks. Probably a lot of the reasons that it's traded more widely than other areas, but is not as central as other wares, is because it doesn't dominate assemblages like Mimbres and Cibola and other wares. A lot of times people had it, but it wasn't the most common type of decorated pottery they have. Perhaps an analogy would be that San Juan Red Ware was like some type of nice fancy bowl that you pulled out for special occasions, like feasting, but it maybe wasn't what you use most often outside of the areas where it was made. A lot more can be said about San Juan Red Ware, particularly if you combine it with other lines of material culture and other lines of evidence. But this project has been a lot of fun for me to work on, and I think the continuing increase in available data sets that I was able to take advantage of is something to really look forward to and to continue to support and take advantage of. I want to again thank the Hexagon chapter in Crow Canyon. This presentation would not have been possible without those who assisted with my master's thesis, particularly Jim Allison. And then, of course, I took most of the data from the CyberSouthwest project, which was made possible by a huge number of people and organizations. I don't think you could count how many ceramic analysis would have contributed to the data that was eventually put into the database. And then I also want to give a shout out to Matt Peoples for assisting me with this presentation, providing some great input, although any mistakes I made are certainly mine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. Let me start sharing I would suggest that we keep your screen as a sharing, because I think there's a few questions that have come in that people are going to ask you to go back to certain graphics to talk about them a little bit further. So thank you for that great presentation. Really interesting. I have a question coming in from Ben Bellarado, and he wants a little clarification about basically what you're saying about the distribution of Cibola whiteware and San Juan Red Ware is that as the distribution of Cibola whiteware expanded, San Juan Red Ware range retracted. Is that sort of the pattern that you're seeing? Are they I guess the question is, are they connected in any way?
I think they're not as directly connected. It seems that as the Chaco network, which mainly was Mesa Verde whiteware in that area, but then also a lot of Cibola stuff, expanded in southwestern Colorado, particularly right before you have Aztec and Salmon constructed. you have a decrease in San Juan Red Ware in the area. And then later in time, you have a lot more white wares that dominate the Mesa Verde area, whereas in other parts of the Southwest, red wares are much more common. And so the centrality, I don't think, is as closely related, except in the Four Corners region, where during the 800s, it does seem like San Juan Red Ware was more prominent in the networks, and Cibola whiteware was less prominent. Good question.
Great. I have a couple of requests to go back to certain slides. One person would like you to go back to your conclusion slide. I'm assuming so they can take a picture of it or something. But let's go back to that one and go back to your conclusions for just a second.
Apparently, I scrolled so far that it kicked me just off of everything. All right.
Kicked you off.
Oh, I got to share my screen again in just a second.
Okay.
Okay. All right, should be back. And then 4.
Okay, great. So while we have this up, I can start asking a few of the other questions. So Bruce wants to know, what's the furthest west location of red ware in Utah? What's sort of the furthest west site you had that identified?
Utah. So the St. George area has San Juan Red Ware, and then the Virgin River goes through St. George and then into southeastern Nevada, where I'm from actually, in the Lost City Museum of Archaeology fame, and there's San Juan Red Ware found there as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, one of the distribution slides, there was a couple of questions about the hexagons and what the hexagons are representing. A particular question, I'm not sure exactly which one it was on, but I think you can talk about this question if you get any one of those up. Okay, so the question is, on these distribution slides, is there a particular pottery type that represents the white hexagon that's increasing, flowing as the San Juan Red Ware wanes? So I think maybe just clarify, because I don't think that's what you're saying here, right? But can you explain a little bit more about, like, the white color would represent that there's very little?
Yeah, so the very bottom of this scale here is white. So that doesn't mean, there was some San Juan Red Ware in all of the hexagons. Otherwise, I just removed the hexagon from the map. Okay. But that means it was found only in trace amounts, very low percentages.
Great.
And then, what types of pottery replaced it just varies across the area. Segi orange ware being one of the ones that replace it later in time.
Emiliano says, excellent presentation. In the case of Chaco Canyon, based on your results, which region or area had the stronger interaction? So you didn't really look at that exactly, but do you have an idea of that connection?
Yeah, if I remember right, I haven't looked at this for a while. It's been a few years since I dug into that for my master's thesis, but it was sites on the western side of the canyon. I remember a lot of the big sites did have trace amounts, but I think they date later in time. But along the Chaco River, some of the sites there, you had San Juan Red Ware present, so it seemed to follow that channel down into the area.
Great. Barbara Mills says that Hegman and others have argued that San Juan Red Ware was an early example of specialized production. So how do sites that were likely producers of the ware relate to other sites in terms of both the dominant ware and centrality? So are you seeing that specialized production evidence in your data?
I think the best evidence for the specialized production is some of the other archaeological context. But the sites that produce it, there's a lot of variation in southeastern Utah, where some sites don't have very much, and then sometimes some sites have a lot. But it does seem that some of the big producers were really dominated by San Juan Red Ware. Early in time, Alkali Ridge, that's almost all you find is the San Juan Red Ware, the Abajo, and the Bluff Black on Red. But then as far as centrality goes, I don't think they're actually very central to the network because they're so dominated by San Juan Red Ware. Mm-hmm. So they show us lower centrality.
Okay. Great, thank you. Another question came in on Facebook, and this is about another one of your hexagon maps. And this is the one where you were sort of grouping sites. And the question is about, this person was just a little confused about the Mimbres area, that you lumped that into it's 5 hexagons, not 5 sites, right? So all the sites were grouped.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just explain that a little bit.
So in the Mimbres area, these are the hexagons that were overlain. All of the sites were combined into one of these points. So yeah, it's a lot of aggregation of sites. And one of the problems I noticed when I was doing my master's thesis is that areas that have just a whole bunch of sites, often from a project like the Animas La Plata project on the Colorado and New Mexico border, had tons and tons of sites. Many of them had a lot of San Juan Red Ware, but there's so many of them that it completely overwhelmed the network. So finding a way to aggregate them gives you a clearer picture of what's happening in the broader area rather than in a smaller area where there just happen to be tons of sites.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question has come in. Was there any weighting of whole pots or vessels versus sherds in your study or in any of the databases, or were sherds and individual or whole vessels viewed similarly?
They are viewed the same, which is a great point and a good caveat to some of the data. Overall, it should overwhelm the whole vessels, but there are probably some sites where that makes a big difference. If you break the vessel into pieces, you have suddenly tons more San Juan Red Ware than you used to have, which can be a problem in ceramic analyses.
Great. Okay, so I think I have one more question, and this question is more for you to talk about how you're going to take this research and put it into your dissertation research. So I guess talk a little bit more about what you're going to do for your dissertation project.
Yeah, so my dissertation is still looking at networks, but it's taking a bit different direction, and I'll be focused on the areas around the Hopi and Zuni and all of the areas in between, as well as up into Kayenta and then down into the Tonto Basin. But I'm just looking at ceramics in these networks. The real question is what happens when you add other types of artifacts, and then overall, what do these networks that I'm showing here, how do those relate to the actual interaction that happened in the past? Because these are just pots wandering around by themselves, and we know that didn't happen. There were people. What is that real relationship? So I'm going to look at networks using projectile points, so arrowheads, all of the pottery stuff you see here, but then also adding in different types of architecture, and then obsidian sourcing and ceramic sourcing, so we can see what objects really came from different areas. Combine all of these types of analyses into a multi-layer network, and then see how well do these patterns correlate, and are there differences in different types of artifacts that you can see.
Sounds really interesting. We'll have to get you back here to talk about that when you're done with it.
Yeah, hopefully not too many years.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Robert. This was great. We really enjoyed listening to you talk about this project, and I think we have a couple more questions coming in, but well, I'm not sure there. We don't. It's okay. We'll go ahead and say that we're done. But thank you so much. This was a great presentation, Robert.
Thank you for having me.